Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another fabulous show. This one is an esteemed panel. I'm really interested. There's going to be some quite substantial and deep discussion, I think, about this particular theme, which is trust in a trustless world. With us this afternoon, I think everyone's up on stage, or they were, but let's go there again. Welcome Catherine Maxwell, General Manager of Policy and Advocacy at the Governance Institute of Australia. We have Professor Dali Kaafar, Group Leader of Information and Privacy at CSIRO D61, and the Chief Scientist at Optus Macquarie University's Cyber Security Hub. We have Yaël Eisenstat, who we just saw before. We're well known to all of us now, but also we didn't say, a fellow at Cornell Tech, which is a new facility in New York. You're joining that, a bunch of other things, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And we have Cade, who's the founder and CEO of Trustonic. So give them the welcome, actually, say hello and give them a clap. We're going to talk about trust and the impact of trust, particularly in the crazy world that we're seeing at the moment. I'm going to set it up with a couple of things that I'm sure many of you are across. The ACCC's Digital Platforms Inquiry. Embedded in that inquiry is some very interesting things around privacy, changes to the Privacy Act. It has a big impact on what we do with data and how we share people's data. The ACCC is talking about changing the definition of personal information to include things like device IDs, IP addresses, and geolocation data. So suddenly, and also recommending that the consent to use your data is a default off. Currently in the Privacy Act, it's on. So there are some significant challenges or changes if the federal government decides to take on the recommendations about how the entire technology industry uses and does things with data. That leads into this whole issue around trust. Before we go to the panel, I just want to throw one thing up, or a couple of stats up, which I think is very interesting from a consumer study across 8 countries by a company called We Communications, asking about public sentiment and attitudes towards technology and innovation and their fears. Some really interesting figures come through that in Australia, at least, out of the 8 markets, are the most anxious in the world about the promise of unprecedented innovation and technology. There is a quote from the managing director of the company, Ellen van der Molen, who said that companies are moving so fast that they've got sloppy in implementation. There's some issues there around what happens with trust as a result of that. And the Australian public, what they're most fearful of, and I think this is fascinating, 84% say they're fearful that their personal data is not secure. That's probably fairly obvious. 80% say my family or I can be compromised online. 77%, wait for this one, 77% say hackers could shut down the power grid. 72% are worried that their customer service reps will be bots or won't be people anymore. 67% are worried about being hit by a self-driving car. 63% think their phone is listening to them. That used to be a conspiracy theory. Yaël may have some different views on that, because there's a bunch of people that in my world that sort of think they've done the sailing in Croatia, and suddenly something happens, whether an ad comes at you 30 minutes later. So they're convinced that's already happening. And 54% are worried that AI will end their jobs. So that's a sort of a take on the public sense around technology and the fears. We're going to talk a little bit around this, well, a lot around this trust issue. And Dali, I think we'll go to you first. We do have a trust problem. I'm assuming that's where you think there's some challenges there. But the interesting thing here is people say they're concerned about data, their security, their privacy. But if we think about their behaviour, something very different is happening that would suggest that at least the concerns are there, but the behaviour is very different. So where's this disconnect? What do you make of this disconnect, and how big is this trust issue?
All right. Look, I don't know actually whether we have a problem or not. All I know is that it's actually a complicated matter, right? We start talking about trust, and you're bringing the aspect of, you know, our behavior towards different technology, and we can talk a lot about us really realizing that there are threats when it comes to our personal data, for instance, and you mentioned a number of statistics out there. Another interesting one is 59% of Australians are actually declared, very openly that they would switch to another service if they realize that a service is breaching their privacy. Yet, I don't think that 59% of Australians switched, to a different service than Facebook. And I know Facebook is the easy target here, and I actually was not.
You were trying
to talk about.
Yes.
I was trying to avoid talking about Facebook, and but yeah, that's actually I think a sort of disconnect when it comes to our behavior and our attitude towards technology. Look, I think it's actually a complicated problem because notions of trust and notions of privacy are very, very complicated to capture. Each of us has here a different definition of what is really privacy, what notions of privacy we're trying to protect. Legislation is not helping because actually I think legislation is also struggling with the understanding, how to frame notions of leakage, information leakage, how to frame notions of consent, how to frame notions of enabling trust in the technology in a proper way. And we get used to these technologies. I mean, I'm considering myself as being a privacy cautious guy and tech-savvy guy, and yet I was mentioning this earlier to Ben. When I really need Google Map, I just open the app and use it, and I'm not really protecting myself against Google knowing every bit of my movements and my location privacy. I think there is a disconnect because we get so much used to this technology that it becomes really a very, very big essential of our daily lives, and yet I think we should really be adapting our behavior to different contexts and to try to enable notions. And I know that we'll potentially talk a lot about notions of trust and how we really should enforce these notions of trust in the technology and our daily behavior. From us people to industry and government agencies and so on, how we really should enforce those notions of trust. But I think as consumers and customers and end users of such technology, we should really be very, very careful in how we're really adopting such and such technology. And we should really enforce the one particular aspect that I truly believe in, which is making these private companies believe that they have no choice but to have privacy and trust as a key differentiator in their business. They really have to invest in that. They really have to put the time and the money to make sure that our privacy is protected and to be able to use it, to use our data, because that's actually their business model. Our data is their business model, right? To use it in a proper way.
And we'll come back to some of the ways around this or ways to work through this that you're working on, Dali. But in terms of the Governance Institute, Catherine, I guess your views on that and whether the companies are deeply appreciating or understanding the risks that look like they're coming this way, both from regulators and the way they engage with their people. What's your thinking on this?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The Australian Institute of Company Directors did a survey on innovation, particularly looking at technology, and it painted a pretty woeful picture in terms of boards' knowledge and understanding of technology, let alone the level of skills on boards in relation to new technology. So I think outside the really tech sector, you've got these companies being run by people who really don't know a lot about technology.
No digital literacy at all?
Very low. I think, what were the
say.
stats? They were 3% of directors said they hold science and technology expertise, and only 3% indicated they had international experience, and 10% said they brought innovation experience into the boardroom. So I think it's a pretty sobering picture of boardroom behaviour. And it was quite interesting. Today, the corporate regulator, ASIC, released a report about board oversight of non-financial risks and said that they looked at 30,000 documents. They sure didn't get out the highlighter, which is how you used to look at documents, and go through a box. They must have used some form of technology to get through that task. So they are being regulated by people and by agencies who are using technology right here, right now. So I don't think there's a good enough knowledge. And certainly at Governance Institute, I would not have thought myself someone who would get in the top technology space, but we're certainly starting to look at it as an issue. And a lot of our members, particularly those who work with very large companies, are starting to look at, well, are there different ways using technology in the boardroom, face recognition to make sure you're holding secure board meetings, all those sorts of things. So I think there's a lot happening.
Ben, you're based out of the UK, so your sense on both the public, this disconnect between the trust issue from public and what's going on and what you do, because you might want to give it a little bit of a lowdown, but you're a company where you've had a lot of work in embedding securing devices, 2 billion devices, is that right? You've got going out there with your technology. Explain a little bit about that and what your sense is with this trust issue.
Well, I think one of the big challenges we see is, everybody talks about the Internet of Things, right? And that's the juncture of lots of things that talk to other things that communicate with people that communicate with services. And fundamentally, that is only going to happen if there is trust in that system and levels of trust, right? It's not binary, right? It's shades of gray. But what we are doing, and our reason for existing, right, is to put better security foundations in those devices, because there's an old saying that you can have security without trust, but you can't have trust without security, right? So, in this sort of connected world, what we want to do is start saying, look, how can a thing prove it is what it claims to be? Right? Because we're talking today, we're of a generation where, I might trust you because we've worked together, or because I trust somebody else that's introduced me to you and has vouched for you. But in the digital world, there are things that will never be touched by a human being. And so we have to infer trust. But we can't do that if the basis that we're building that trust on is fundamentally flawed. So really, what Trustonic's focus is, but generally what industry's focus should be, is making sure the foundations are secure and that we can start building better trust from there. But what I would say, and it's very interesting that we talk about what do Australians think about, or what do Brits think about, other than Brexit and the disaster that it is.
Yes, we know that answer, don't we,
technology is global, right? Information is now global, right? And so therefore we have to have a mindset around solving these problems that are globally scalable, right? Europe is obviously progressive on things like GDPR. California's come out with a IoT security standard. But to me, technology is best when it democratizes access and gives people choice. But we're actually in a time where the opposite is happening, and large companies, and I'm not going to name names, right, are using their leverage and their size to bully out and remove competition. And actually, if you have things like fragmented specifications that you have to comply with, guess what? Only the large device manufacturers, only the large global service providers are going to be able to compete. And then net, yes, of course, we're weak, because actually their power is comparable to major governments.
Well, they're great points, but do you think that, say, the technology that you've got, I'm just interested in trying to understand, is it a genuine firewall that can be communicated to a community that says you're safe with, whether it's yours or whoever else? How does that actually play out?
So what we do is, and we work with most of the world's Android. California Fruit Company likes to do everything themselves, right? But we're really there to say two things, right? Can a device prove that it is what it claims to be? Okay. Now that's true in a smartphone, but it can be true in an autonomous vehicle or a sensor. How do you know the data that's been generated from what claims to be a bridge sensor on Chelsea Bridge is actually that sensor? And the second part of that is trusted execution, which is basically to say, okay, you might prove that you're that sensor, but how do I trust the integrity of your data? Okay. So this is really about giving those fundamental foundations that other people can then do innovative things with. So in a smartphone, the sad reality is the vast majority of applications out there, and I include banking applications, social media, are actually not very secure. Okay? They haven't really had privacy in mind, they haven't had security in mind, and it doesn't take an awful lot to circumvent that. And you just see the attacks on WhatsApp and so forth. There's better tools that people can do. But there's an inertia around, well, what is the value of security? I'll just wait till I'm breached, and then maybe I'll pay a lot of money to try and dig myself out of it. So what we're trying to do is give people better tools that they can do things differently. But to your point, fundamentally, it's all about saying, I have a relationship as a consumer with a brand or a set of brands. And trust takes forever to build, People spend lots and lots of money on advertising, the Coca-Colas of this world, and yet now in this digital world, it can be destroyed in a second. So I think there's slowly growing awareness of that, but people feel, for whatever reason, lethargic, I would say, around actually making those changes and actually committing forward.
I'm going to come to you in a minute, Dali, but Yaël, you've got a very strong view on trust, and it's eroding. When you hear this conversation, what do you think? More of the same?
Well, so it was interesting when you mentioned that we all are talking about how people are losing trust in so many of these companies, but yet they're not stopping to use them. I would argue that's because they don't have an alternative for some of these companies, right? Like, if Coca-Cola lost your trust because they poisoned somebody or whatever, then people would go drink Pepsi. But unfortunately, in the companies that we're not going to name, but I'm going to name, there is no alternative to Facebook. There's alternatives to Google, but not really. So without getting into the whole antitrust thing, oh, I didn't realize the word trust was there. And see how I did that there. But we don't really even have a choice. And I mean, everything I know, and I also don't have the smartest digital security for myself either, because I think one thing that's really interesting is, I think this is eroding, but people want to trust that their government is actually protecting them, right? So I think a lot of people believe that certain things wouldn't be legal if they were absolutely abusing us, and so why shouldn't I use this? Because if it was absolutely abusing me, it would be illegal.
They wouldn't be allowed to sell it, yeah.
Right. So it's all of that is not keeping up to speed with the technology sector.
Dali, you have a view. I mean, I think we probably all agree that, and certainly your line is that, that trust will be a differentiator for business. Talk through that, and also your thinking around what you call implicit and explicit trust, and how that relates to the technology sector and enterprise government.
Okay, I can be quite passionate about that, so big disclaimer, please hold on for 2 minutes. I'll actually, try to make a few points here. Actually, one of my PhD students last time mentioned that the S in IoT was related to security, and I added that P in IoT is related to privacy. And I think, this is to the point that, yes, there are fundamental trust issues with all this technology that we have to address. And so far, and this is essentially related to the no alternative point that Yaël was trying to make. I think for ages, we've been really operating under either a no trust type of situation or an implicit trust type of situation, where we implicitly trust government to process our data in the right way, so we're happy, this is government, it should be all right, right? And yet, maybe with lots of these scandals that are happening here and there, and too often, unfortunately, we realize that, that notion of implicit trust is probably not the right approach to how we should, or how these companies should handle our data. And so I think we should really move and try to shift the whole landscape, the whole ecosystem into notions of explicit trust. What does that really mean? Essentially, it's building notions where it's not for us to implicitly assume that our data is well processed. It's actually for companies to provably show to us that our data is in safe hands, or our data is provably processed in a good way, in a privacy-preserving way. So trust, building or enforcing explicit trust in systems, in technology, in humans, and in data processing. And I would like to make, for example, one instance of this where we talk today a lot about machine learning and AI, right? And this is on the rise. It's actually not. The future is happening right now. Amazon is running machine learning as a service. Companies are actually throwing training data within Amazon clouds. Other companies, other partners are really querying this data, extracting analytics, extracting insights from our data that is sitting out there. We don't even know that our data is there. And today there's a lot of research showing that these machine learning are exposed to a number of threats, essentially things related to being able to expose that my data is part of a training setting, that, or more generally, that my data can be inferred from just running this training set on machine learning, not to mention things associated with confidentiality of models and data and so on. So we really have to make sure that such a service is provably private, showing that rigorously you can't really infer things from that data that I contributed to the model. And machine learning is just an example. We mentioned identities, multiple identities. When I use Facebook, I shouldn't be implicitly trusting that my data will be properly processed. I should have guarantees on traceability of my data. Who is using my data, what time, what sort of data is being used, what sort of insights, accountability. If things go wrong, who should I blame in that whole supply chain? Fine, my data is being used, so I'm using that particular service for free, but tell me exactly who's responsible for my data. Do you have the right mechanism? Do you have the proofs from a cryptographic point of view to the mathematical definition of trust, how my data is being used and processed? This is what I call really explicit trust.
Explicit, but to get to that point, is that a regulatory regime? Is it can industry do it on its own? Is there a global standard that's required? How do you get to that?
So it's a bunch of things. It's definitely not only a technical problem. I think legislation has to catch up with a number of progress that have been made within the technological development. We mentioned GDPR early. I'm sorry. I mean, this is perhaps a little bit of bad news, but everyone here probably has this impression that GDPR is the most advanced legislation when it comes to privacy. Yet, when you really open up that little that huge sort of documentation related to GDPR regulation, and you actually read the little T's and C's, and you really realize that GDPR is talking about pseudonyms as a way of enabling proper de-identified data. I mean, researchers and people who are really cautious or have a little bit of expertise in privacy would be laughing at that. I mean, this is where really the legislation is so far behind, not really catching up with the threats, with the advances in technology, and with the way that we should really be doing things. It's not an easy thing, because actually sometimes it becomes too technical, so that you really have to have a sort of, you don't want to have a narrow view of how technology should, encompass or should really enforce some of the notions of, consent, traceability, accountability, and so on and so forth. But it is something that we have to think through, both technology experts and legislation, but also industry. Industry has a huge, role to play there. Alternatives, this morning I was talking about how I was seeing a number of initiatives recently in people trying to get into the browser market. If someone really was telling me that people are trying to build alternatives to Chrome, to Safari, and to Firefox, Mozilla Firefox, 3-4 years ago, I would be, I think I would be laughing, right? I think this is really a tough market. You guys would be competing with big giants there, right? Yet Brave, I think they are brave. They are doing it. They are getting into that market. Look at what Opera did, right? They just added a little feature there that says here is a built-in VPN. They're attracting, a large amount of customers just interested in that VPN setting, because essentially Opera is saying we do care about your privacy.
So Ben, can I ask you though, that you talked earlier about the apathy. So to get to this point of getting industry, technology, and government aligned on this and getting some progress, if there's apathy, is it going to be regulation that forces it? Is there standards? Where do you sit on trying to get this thing through? Because in the end, I'll come to Catherine and Yaël in a minute, is that because the implications if we don't, but the apathy, how do you enforce this stuff?
So I think Dali actually provided a great summary of actually the problem is simple can be a lot harder than complex. Right? And when we're talking about the value of trust and the value of privacy, right? These are balancing scales, right? To have useful information and a service, you need to balance some level of privacy, right? Today, it's too hard, it's too fragmented. You try, you go in, you manage your cookie policies, you go through all of the many layers in these social media apps, and don't even try Yahoo, right? It's impossible, right? But I think on the other side, there is a role for, I don't know whether it's government, I think it should be government, but through some sort of global standard that says, look, effectively, you start with some level of opt-out. And when you subscribe to a service, okay, it should be clear, are you paying for the service? Or are you getting the service for free in return for X, Y, or Z? The data leakage right now is so creepy and so extensive that frankly, most people give up. I try, I use DuckDuckGo as my default browser, but when I can't get access to the information, I go back to Google because I'm impatient. I want access to service, and I'm no different to anybody else, right? So it's a real effort right now. As Dali mentioned, there are initiatives around secure browsers, around secure environments, and we should be understanding that if I pay, how else are you going to survive, right? You have to pay salaries, you have to make money. So if that's going to be the case, even in a not-for-profit, and I used to run a not-for-profit, you have to pay people, right? So there has to be more awareness that here's your choice. You can have free, and this is what you give up, right? And it might be a sliding scale. Or you can have paid for, and this is what you don't give up, right? But at the moment, it's too hard. And also, then you go into things like, I use Uber or whatever, you've got to give access to your contacts. Okay, there's a completely legitimate reason why I might need that. But they now have permission to access my contacts for whatever reason they so choose as well. So I think it is a real challenge. And to distill it down, to me, effectively, it's about sitting down and saying, how do major governments align around a policy that is consistent across the globe, where people say this is a starting point. And that is the job of government, actually, is to make the difficult decisions on behalf of the people themselves are not able or not willing to make, right? And that may mean that you don't no longer get access by default to all of these nice free services, because actually there's a cost to that you don't really understand.
Yeah, do we have, that's a 3 to 5 year at best proposition to try and get that right, maybe 137 years perhaps, but do we have the time, Yaël, to get to that point? And if we don't, what happens?
That was a big existential
I know,
question.
thank you. Well,
Over to you.
Lucky you.
I mean, the reality of us being able to come up with global standards, I fully believe that that's what we need as well. I just don't see it happening. I mean, because who's going to lead that? The United Nations? I mean, who's going to lead the global standard?
There is an international standards body, but it's a very slow-moving
right.
body.
And there's so many reasons. Obviously, for example, part of the problem is the U.S. is so steeped in this freedom of speech culture, and then you have, I mean, even if you just compare U.S. and Germany, there's no way those two countries are going to have the same idea on what content moderation looks like, because they have two totally different histories around freedom of speech. So yes, I absolutely hope that someday we will have a global standard. I'm not overly optimistic about it. But I do think, so in the US, there's like this little not so well kept secret that part of the reason why you have some states actually proposing some pretty out there regulation, it's because...
This is privacy legislation you're talking about?
Yes, or any other kind of legislation around big tech. It's because there's no way that a big tech company can actually abide by different regulation in every country, or let alone every state. So in the US, part of the reason why different states are doing that is to try to actually force these big companies to actually cooperate with government to make a national standard, so they don't have to operate differently in 50 states. So if you do have Australia and Europe and the US all having different sorts of regulation around this, it's going to actually force the hand of some of these companies to step up and say, we need a global standard.
Well, and so respond to that, I'd completely agree, right? I mean, it is a junction of government and industry collaborating to get to something that is, let's call it minimum viable, right? And that can be done, and it is being done in various stages, and Facebook has its processes and others have their processes. It's about aligning that to something that's more easily accessible. But the reality to the point is some of this will take years, and in the meantime technology rolls on. So we have to have other answers to this beyond that. And one thing that we provide tools, right, that can make users secure, the service you enjoy more secure, your data more, better looked after, your privacy better looked after. But if you're not even aware how bad the current state is, what difference does it make? So actually this is where you're seeing other people start to move into the market to say, well, let's do application sort of assessments, look at the security, is it really secure? Is it really looking after your data? Because actually when people start realizing that, then people start moving very quickly to say, oh, hang on, we really should do a proper job there. So at least there are low-hanging fruit activities I think we can do. It's not necessarily in large institutional organizations' interest.
That said, though, Dali, sorry, Catherine, you were going to say something?
I was just going to say, look, we've actually been thinking a lot about this stuff. Companies can't really afford to wait for government to catch up. So I think it's a whole range of things. Yes, it's legislation. And I think if you look at a lot of the things that the ACCC is recommending, they're actually about consumers trusting platforms. And hey, they've invented a new tool. They don't do that very often. It's pretty rare.
Yeah.
Of a serious invasion of privacy. You know, that's almost unheard of. So that's partly about trust. But I think for companies that actually want to do well in this space, they've actually got to get some good, solid governance processes around technology, what they're doing, what's the state, you know, what are their processes, what's their risk management like, because otherwise they're going to come completely unstuck.
And are they there? Where is the awareness at that level? That's emerging.
It's emerging, I think, and that's a real problem as well.
Dali, what do you think about the fact that regulation alignment globally is a millennia project, and what is the next best option? And talk about the Census Bureau in the US as an example there of where it's an organisation that's done it without regulation. It's sort of getting on the front foot.
Yeah. So government, industry, researchers, I think they need to be involved in some of that discussion. Otherwise, you'll have always that sort of, oh, we've told you type of setting, which happened lots and lots of times, right? All these scandals about re-identification and data breaches happening out there.
Right. Well, that's the risk. Groundhog Day, right? That's the risk.
Yeah, and I think actually, just to follow up on a little bit of that discussion, I think we need some sort of, watchdog platform. Maybe the government actually could offer that. Really, could offer a way where we look at private companies and say we have a platform that names and shames, right? When it really, truly believed, or caught with bad processing of the data. Yeah, it's happening right now in an ad hoc way, just journalists picking up something and say, yeah, Facebook has done this, that particular agency has done that, and so on. I think it's really interesting and would be extremely important for consumers to have, a source of reference where they really realize how, what sort of product, what sort of platforms they should choose from based on particular interest, on their own definition or their own appreciation of privacy. Yeah, so, essentially to come to your point about the regulation side of things and how I think initiatives have been, I think in that particular case, I think US is, again, somehow from a privacy point of view, for example, and to enable some form of explicit trust when it comes to data and this notion of provable privacy that I was referring to earlier. I think US here is, again, showing us the way. I don't know, should I say fortunately or unfortunately, but, one particular instance of that I would like maybe to mention is the US Bureau of Census Bureau. Essentially, back in 2018, just before that, in 2016, they started to have this idea of releasing US census statistics in a provably private way, right? Now that has a number of implications where essentially if you really are trying to provide something truly private, you essentially pay a cost, and that cost is at the utility of that data. So your data is no more that useful as if, when compared to, just original data, as you may expect. And that, the Bureau at that time really had, or had to face a number of big resistance coming from so many different institutes, researchers, analysts really using that particular data. I mean, people have to realize that the US census data is extremely, obviously is actually extremely rich, but it's really used by a number of different partners, institutes, private companies, and so on. So people have been pushing back this idea of providing something that is noisy, protected, protecting people's privacy. Yet, 2018, they insisted. They actually were at the front of implementing a notion that is extremely popular within the privacy community, which is called differential privacy. And they made it through, and they decided that US Census 2020 will actually operate under that provable privacy framework. And this is, I think, a good illustration of how organizations, in this particular case, an organization, government organization, should really try to steer a little bit how the how the legislation could be driven or could be drawn. Things should come actually from government, because government is supposed, we're really used to government protecting, or at least we're expecting government to protect our own interests and protecting their citizens. But I think, we should take those risks in making the government changing its mind and changing the ways it's really trying to steer the legislation by having insiders essentially within the government that take that extra step and doing it properly.
So we have an American on the stage, strangely enough. I just noticed the accent. Your sense, Yaël, on a government department driving that, do you believe that private enterprise can do that? Is there enough incentive for them to be progressive on some of these policies, or are they going to need some sort of forced hand?
I think sure. If for the private companies who actually have paying customers, it is in their best interest to maintain trust of those customers. So again, there are companies, including one that I just spent the last 5 months with, who are very much thinking about how do we ensure that we are not going to lose this trust, that we're not abusing our customers. So absolutely.
Just a little bit to that, Uber, Microsoft, Google, Facebook are actually pushing hard, at least at the surface, towards an idea of where our data is treated in a differentially private way. Now, what is really happening with every single service associated with these companies is something else. That might be just the tip of the iceberg. There might be actually just...
Yeah, I was going to say, the problem there, you talk about the trust issue, I need some convincing on that stuff.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to argue with that one a little bit. Because they're pushing for things that they know are easy for them. Everything they're doing is, though, pushing responsibility onto someone other than them. But to go back to...
As in they're not doing it. Or they are.
No. They put out some platitudes to make you all believe that they are working with government on data privacy things, while at the same time, I mean, their response to the ACCC was unbelievably arrogant.
Oh, I totally agree. This is actually what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I mean, on the surface,
Yeah.
they're claiming to have that sort of attitude.
But so yes, I do believe that companies who actually use customers' data to serve the customer something absolutely can lead some of the way. That is a very different business model, though. It's the people who are using our data to manipulate us. Everything I talked about earlier, I do not in any way trust them.
Yeah.
So I just want to differentiate. There's lots of good companies in the tech industry that can.
Ben, I'm just going to say we've got a few minutes left. Ben's going to talk, but if you've got some questions, we're going to throw to the floor. Get these people while you can, so get ready for some questions. I'll come back to you. But Ben, you're about to give some wisdom.
Well, yeah, I'm not sure about that. But so, I mean, to me, there is, I think, a very logical and easy first step forward, which is about opting in as opposed to opting out. And I think there's a difference between I have a relationship with you as a service provider. I'm giving you some information, access to information, because it's needed for a service, right? It's needed for you to be able to authenticate me, make decisions about me. And there needs to be another layer, which is, giving you permission to pass my data to a third party, and in what form? And I think that the default maximal form is actually some level of privacy preserving, not directly attributable information. So I think those steps are absolutely possible. In fact, some providers do that. But today, there is no easy way for a consumer to just assess, are you, a service provider with a gold standard, or sort of minimum, or even effectively quite dubious, right? And that, I think, just in the same way you buy a product that's got an energy rating, or Europe is heading towards these sort of kite marks for IoT devices, I'd like to think that in the near term, people will start buying devices that actually say, actually, we take care of your security. That in itself just gives you a basis, right? The second part is, I'm going to use services that are trustworthy.
Got a rating of some sort.
And some way of grading that, it can't be that hard. I'm sure you've got smart people operating that are doing these kinds of assessments that could do that assessment. It has to be autonomous, right? But I don't see a reason why you can't do that, and I don't see a reason why you can't download, maybe it's a business opportunity, I don't know, but download an application that just says, actually, I will take care of your security by default. This is your position. and I'll handle all of that with your apps. And if you want to move and share more, you can do that, but I'll make sure it doesn't overshare and you make, accidentally trip and
That
give
sounds
all
like
your
an
data.
amazing business opportunity.
Yeah.
Yes,
Somebody
exactly.
out there must have a great idea.
But here, and this is why, here's a classic example of Dali, I'll get if you've got some thoughts on it, but a great example of this is that I'm not the savviest dude on the planet. I downloaded a bit of privacy VPN software for blocking, for ad blocking and blocking data leaks and so forth. And I used to like looking at until last week, I used to like looking at my thing and saying, oh, you blocked 170 trackers this morning or whatever it might be. Then I was talking to someone who knew more about it than I did in the technology game and said, actually, the problem with some of those VPN privacy protection apps is they're the ones leaking the data to the bigger system. And I went, oh, crikey, that's the whole thing I was trying
There's
not
nowhere
to do.
safe.
So a couple of years ago, we've done analysis of security of these VPN apps, right, that we use when we really care about our privacy on these mobile devices globally, right? And we actually updated.
Oh, it was you
study.
telling me, wasn't it?
I think
of
it
course,
was,
that's
yeah.
right. There we go.
And actually, we updated this very recently, and I mean, these are ironic sort of findings out there. 20% of these apps that are pretending to offer you some sort of VPN protection were not encrypting traffic at all. They were just, lures. 66% were actually leaking DNS information. Wherever you visit, a page or whatever, they were just leaking that DNS attribute, essentially providing zero privacy when it comes to the web browsing. Injection of JavaScript. Malware prisons, 28% had actually some malware embedded into those.
Right.
I can't keep going, but that's actually sort of, and ironically, when we looked at the, how people were rating those things, they're just extremely highly ranked. People were actually, sort of very happy with the level of security and privacy without realizing that,
Well, it's a great sum up of the trust issue we have, and thanks for that. Thanks for being the source of my despair, Dali. That's really helpful. If there's any questions from the floor, I can see if you got anyone to ask any of these panel. Otherwise, I will. I want to go back to yes. So
There's one.
there is one. I can't see. Sorry, if you've got the mic, just fire away.
Should be on. There we go.
Yes, here we go.
Stephen Porges. I'm the ex-CEO of the Australian Alliance for Data Leadership, so I've lived data for far too long, and for a long period shared all your concerns. I do believe the majority of companies, however, and even some of the bad companies that you mentioned, are generally working with a business model that wants to protect our data most of the time. Something that came up the other day that was sort of interesting, and I'd be interested in your view on it, was that, so I said, Stephen, do you put a balaclava on when you walk around the streets? Do you really care if people have all your GPS? Not that much. However, what about product security? And in Australia at the moment, we're a major exporting nation. We export up to China all the time. You wander into a wine shop in China and you're pretty close to guaranteed that none of the wine is real. You walk into a US supermarket and it's estimated that 80% of the olive oil is fake. Should we be more concerned about product trust rather than this current obsession with data trust that might not be as serious as we think?
Great provocative position. I like those, so I'm going to quote. Thank you.
I'll take that. Actually, I think we should be concerned about both. So on the genuine part of things, I think, I don't think actually I would be arguing against the fact that some companies, organizations, private or public, are doing things in a genuine way to protect individuals' privacy. Here's the thing. I've seen actually too often companies really trying extra hard, super hard, to really get things done right when it comes to protecting individuals' privacy. Government agencies, public ones, here in Australia, Europe, and US. Most of the times they're really trying extremely hard to not make any of those headlines that you would see in newspapers and so on. Yet they find themselves caught in some data breaches, in some re-identification issues, and so on. And I believe that the main issue there is that they've been doing things too often in ad hoc way, in probably secure, probably private way, which in a way that I would call DIY type of techniques inherited from ages and ages ago. And when I say ages, it's probably 20 years or 15 years, and that's really ages when it comes to technology. And I can actually give you many, many examples here in Australia how organizations have been trying to protect individuals' privacy against, for example, re-identification issues. They still have been caught because while they were convinced that they've done everything right to get these things protected. And I think this is back to the notion that I was referring to earlier about provable privacy and things where we have a proper understanding and a pragmatic understanding of what a privacy protection should look like from a mathematical perspective, not just from a data governance or a framework perspective. Most of these frameworks, and people probably that are a little bit cautious about privacy have heard about things like 5 Safes framework and so on, sorry. But these things have never been geared to protect our privacy. They are just guidelines. And then when you really provide them to the technical people who are supposed to do the right job, they look at this and they say, what am I supposed to do with this? And they just will be ending up, doing something in an ad hoc way. And then you will find, that at the end of the day, the expectation of what you're trying to achieve and what actually happened are there's a huge disconnect between the two.
Can I just add? Oh.
Sorry, after you, please.
I'll be really quick. All I want to say is I also agree, both. But this is why data privacy is important, but I don't want us to confuse the idea that that's the only thing we're talking about here.
Right.
This is why previously when you asked me, I am more concerned about accountability, responsibility, liability for how your data is used, as opposed to just breaking it down about, are we just so concerned about data privacy? Data privacy is a piece of it, but it's actually more concerning to me about how companies use our data, because every company, it is in their interest to try their hardest to protect the privacy of your data. So I just kind of wanted to
Yeah, no, great point. And we'll get back to the olive oil and what you use in the US.
So I'm worried now. So I'll give you 2 very real examples, okay? And it relates directly to product security, and we're talking about trust, right? There's trust of data. Okay, so do I trust this service is legitimate? 2 things. One, people are literally especially in places like some parts of Latin America, they're literally dying for their smartphone. They're being robbed and they're being killed for their smartphone. So yes, it would be great if individual technology companies had a solution. We're actually working at a government level to effectively make that phone useless, all phones useless, if they're stolen. Because if you just go and sell a solution to one network operator or one device manufacturer, you're not going to eliminate that problem. In fact, you may even make it worse because the thief might be very annoyed with you for having the wrong kind of device. So there's a clear societal benefit for saying better security delivers a solution that is trusted by the consumer, and it gets rid of that, in this case, sort of street theft, also organized crime as well. But a different example, and it was interesting you mentioned about olive oil and alcohol. So I was just in Kuala Lumpur last week, and they have a huge illicit counterfeit trade in alcohol. And the reason the government is motivated to move in this case, yes, there's a health issue, but the primary motivation is the hundreds of millions of dollars that they're missing out on in terms of import duty tax. So there are benefits. How they manifest are different, but it comes to, yes, there is a need for devices, plural, whether it's your smartphone or just the label on the back of a whiskey bottle, to be able to prove that this is, the integrity is there, right? And then you build from there. So I do think it's a very interesting space, but it's also a very fragmented space today.
Listen, we're out of time, but I just ask each one of you then, so what's your hunch on what will win out in the next 5 years in terms of trust and data and products like olive oil? I love that one. I'll come back to that one day. Is carrot or stick? Will the promise of trust as a differentiator and as a business differentiator leap ahead, or it'll be the threat of being named and shamed and having regulatory forces around you that will be the negative side that will force change? That's kind of carrot or stick from the end, Ben. What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I can tell you what works for us today, and it's not selling security, okay? So the people that adopt the better security are people that see, if I use this, I can speed up my user authentication, I can onboard more customers, I can deliver a simpler, faster service, right? Very, very tangible. Yeah. Or, alternatively, if I use this, I save this much money, okay? Those are the two very tangible kind of discussions. The last discussion, and it's very, very rare, is, oh, I really need to make my service more secure. So over the next 5 years, my mission, if you like, and hopefully it won't be too lonely, is to raise more awareness about the real level of security and therefore the real trustworthiness of these services that are out there, so that people's behaviors are changed to being more proactive in thinking about, am I really doing the best job I can do to protect that data, to minimize the leakage of information, to only share what I need to share with third parties. That would be my view.
Yeah.
Both. I don't think it's a binary choice. I think for good actors and good companies who want to maintain trust with their customers, it will be carrot. I think for bad actors, it'll be stick. I actually don't think it's either or. I just think it depends on the company.
No, which way is it? Which way do you think? Anyway, we won't.
I actually think both. I think that again, I have worked with companies.
One won't lead the other. Obviously, one won't be more dominant. Do you think that's, I guess, where I was wanting to lead?
I think the stick is absolutely going to have to happen for certain companies, no question. I think the other companies see that and are going to use carrots. That's what I'm trying to get at.
Okay, Dali?
We're running over time, so I'll be very, very quick. I think the carrot is really in terms of making what I call being a pragmatic optimist happen for organizations, private industries, where we are okay for some level of trust to be guaranteed versus some utility of the data being leaked or whatever, right? So actually the challenge is really to enable algorithms, to enable technologies that make that sort of trade-off happen optimized in an optimized way. The stick is actually to be really monitoring very, very, very thoroughly and very closely that sort of trade-off and make sure that any sort of breach of a contractual definition of trust is monitored closely and perhaps sanctioned.
Right. Governance Australia's position?
Oh, well, I think if you want to see what loss of trust looks like in a sector, have a look at the banking sector. I mean, I've spent a lot of time this year thinking about that. So, if you want to avoid that sort of scenario, trust is going to be fundamental. And it goes back to, I guess, the whole ethical, can we, should we? We can do it, but should we? Yeah. So really starting to think in those terms.
Yeah. Put your hands together. Thank you for the panel. A very interesting conversation. Thanks, guys.